All right. So now I'm unmuted and I'm actually talking to you. Could somebody confirm that they're hearing?
Yes. Yes.
All right. Life is good. So I want to let you know about the nature of this, the protocols first. And one of the points to make about the protocols is that we will be not only making the recording of this event, but uploading it to YouTube after the event. So at that point, you'll be able to email out, and it's our goal to have this go viral, along with whatever else goes viral, like kind of dancing cats. We would like to have one thing, you know, achieve roughly the popularity of a bouncing cat. Now, in terms of the sessions themselves, my role, you know, I'm going to have to time keep. And in timekeeping, I'm only going to announce 5 minutes and done, because I don't want too many interruptions, and done will mean done, although I understand that that means the final word will come, but please do keep track of your own time. The presenters will come in order of the program, and you will all, as basically panelists, you should all be able to mute and unmute yourselves, share your screen, and whatever else it takes to give an effective presentation. So, but if anything goes wrong, we can open the presentation and flip for you. And by we, I mean Stefan Bucher, who's there and is going to be responsible for some key parts of running the program. When you're not a presenter in general, please mute. Okay, so let's talk about how the sessions go. They're 20 minutes presenter 1, 20 minutes presenter 2, 15 minutes discussant. And after that, there's an open discussion. And the format for the open discussion is please post Q&A. In the Q&A, everybody can do that. Not in the thing called chat, but in the thing called Q&A. And in that, you will be able to get your question to Stefan, who, if Stefan likes it, will allow it to be asked. And if Stefan doesn't like it, it will not be asked. Actually, I don't want to give Stefan's Stefan's job is to make it a very interesting discussion. So it will be an interesting discussion, and we'd like that to happen. The issue is we've tried to keep this relatively short, but that does mean that there are breaks after each session, and the breaks aren't entirely just pure breaks. It is possible for you to put your hand up. Everybody should go on break except those who put their hand up, who Stefan will let in to a basically continued discussion format, just in case that people wish to continue talking about the subject that was raised in the session, okay? If you have issues and you suddenly find yourself disconnected, I have nothing more intelligent to say than reconnect to the same link, Zoom link. And if things are really going wrong, email Sloan-NOMIS with a complaint or about, with a question, and we'll try to make sure we can monitor what might be going wrong, and if there's anything we can do about it, we will. Now let me just talk very briefly about the topic and why I think this is such an exciting event and so important intellectually. And bluntly, I think that attention and applied economics is the most exciting new area of economics in my academic lifetime, period. And why that's happened is because it represents a fascinating convergent evolution where almost everybody who's on the panel and many others beside kind of semi-independently stumbled into what looks like a common research project where you're thinking about what people know when they make decisions, what people like when they make decisions, and allowing that to be an interesting variable that must be modeled and measured if you're to understand what people do. So it's a very big meeting point for applied work and theoretical work. As somebody who initiated primarily as a theorist, but always felt that it should be about something that could be measured and tested, I found this area particularly exciting because it suggests to me new types of measurements that I'll be allowed to measure, and it'll be operational, and one day we'll get real big feedback from the data about which of our theories is most apt. And included in this as intention, one of the things I've been studying is costs of learning. And many of us have been studying that and then thinking about, well, why don't people get 100% on a test? I mean, presumably because it's difficult. Why do people make mistakes in so many settings? What's a mistake? How would you know it was a mistake? Amazingly interesting questions, conceptually and data-wise. As we do this, we're connecting with psychology, computer science, and technology, and I think there's a huge future in this kind of team social science. I want to make sure that we capture the moment. We have an incredible audience here. I can tell you that we have registered for the event, in addition to a spectacular group of panelists, we have superb set of graduate students registered, other faculty, and others. And I want to make sure in this bizarre time that we don't miss the opportunity to grow the area and allow people in. So what I think we can do is been talking with Dimitry and with others, and we're thinking of organizing after the event some open office hours that faculty could volunteer, panelists in particular at the moment could volunteer to lead. And it would be kind of once a month for interested, as what I would be offering, once a month for interested students to kind of join and discuss research at the forefront. The two areas that I would be happiest to discuss, and that's what I'd volunteer, because this is supposed to be a Pareto improvement over the isolation we currently live in, would be rational inattention theory and its applications, which I'm clearly very interested in, and the development of novel surveys, which I'm extremely interested in also, and I've already spoken with Søren F. Peterson, who's been developing a lot with me, and we'd be delighted to host some monthly office hours on that. What I would ask all the panelists to do is email to Sloan-NOMIS their interest in so doing, and I will then later on will get the participants and send them an email, see what they would be interested in, and the role of Sloan-NOMIS will be to be clearinghouse and set up whatever those might be. Mentioning the Sloan Foundation and the NOMIS Foundation, I'd like to make absolutely clear how exciting it is that they pioneered this group and they allowed us to pioneer it. And I think that it's got a huge future, that that we would not have been able to start this without the community building that's been possible through the support of the Sloan and NOMIS Foundations, and I can't express my gratitude more deeply. Finally, on my part, I want to say to Anne Stubing, you have saved my life in this event. We had absolutely no chance without you. I want to say to Ashwita, you too. This is not so easy to organize in an isolated setting. We're not the National Bureau of Economic Research. We don't have an army of assistants helping us. roll our own. And we're very much praying that this thing that Ashwita and Anne helped us put together will work. And to Stefan, thank you so much for joining in also, and also to Sophia, who helped us earlier. So I'm done. And Dimitry, would you like to say a few words? And then we'll hand over to Ernst and Mike. And if anybody from the foundation would like to speak, they clearly have the right before we begin.
Okay, I'm just going to echo Andrew in saying how excited I am about the fantastic program. All of the papers, the speakers, and all of the attendees in the conference, you know, I think, you know, are just going to make this a really fun and informative meeting. But I also want to note that while the program looks really fantastic, it was also extremely easy to put together. It didn't take very long to think of the papers and the people, and we could have easily had 4 times as many papers on the program, and it would have looked, you know, same high level of quality. And I think that's a testament to just how much wonderful work there has been recently in measuring and thinking through the implications of inattention, imperfect perception, belief updating, and so forth, in a variety of different settings of obvious economic importance. And I think it's an exciting opportunity for everyone here to get together and talk and share their research findings. You know, in doing so, I think we can think systematically about a few different questions. One, what are the types of empirical strategies that are being used across the different areas of application? And are there some gains from trade? You know, what is kind of the ultimate set of empirical strategies we could be using to measure these phenomena? I think also it'll be useful to think through magnitudes, you know, as we're moving beyond qualitative findings and into measurement of magnitudes. I think it'll be interesting to see how magnitudes from labor econ settings or consumer finance settings compare to each other. And kind of having people from different fields of economics here is going to let us do that. Or at least initiate a conversation where we're really thinking about magnitudes across different settings. And I think third, it'll be interesting to have a conversation about what these magnitudes mean in terms of welfare policy implications and how we use these measurements for out-of-sample prediction. You know, these are all core questions for the economic settings here. You know, all of, you know, these are big, important settings that are going to be discussed here, and it's going to be useful to think through the welfare and out-of-sample predictions. And then thinking through that, I think it'll be helpful to talk about common frameworks that will allow us to do that. What are the underlying models? What are the underlying toolkits and techniques that we can use to address these kinds of questions? So that's how I kind of thought about the program. I'm very excited to discuss all of this research with everyone.
Thanks, Dimitry. Mike and Ernst. Mike, any welcoming words?
Well, I certainly want to welcome everyone. I think it's a very exciting conference. I mean, extending maybe a little bit things Dimitry said about what should be on the agenda for us to be thinking more about. I mean, I think that you know, the beginning of this topic is simply recognizing that people often seem to be inattentive and looking for evidence of departures from what rational decision making would look like if people were correctly informed about the situation they're in. But I think what we should be trying to do is to move beyond that to both ask about whether we can find regularities that would suggest or tend to confirm particular models of the underlying processes that can make more specific predictions about what people will be more aware of and less aware of. And connected to that is not just thinking about theoretical models of this, but asking what kinds of ways of cross-checking or cross-validating assumptions by that assumptions about that may exist. So whether particular views of the cognitive processes will suggest additional types of data that we should be using to help confirm these theories, or whether interesting parallels between processes relevant for economic decision making and processes we see in other domains can be made use of. And I think examples of that will be coming up through the conference, and I would encourage people to sort of keep their eyes on those issues, because I think they're important for the next stage of development of this work.
Excellent. Ernst, would you like to say a few?
No, I don't have much to say except echoing what André Schleifer always likes to say, that we are now in the area of behavioral economics 2.0, and by which he means that we focus on cognitive processes and on psychological concepts that behavioral economics 1.0 didn't, which is attention, perception, and memory. And all of these three terms, I mean, there's a extremely rich literature in psychology and also in cognitive neuroscience on this that explores these terms, attention, perception, memory. We can learn from them. And I think that exciting things are going to come out from this research over the next 10 years or so, or even 10 to 15 years. That's all.
Thank you so much, Ernst. And Ruben, and I see, Ruben, would you like to say something from NOMIS, or is that?
No, just simply that it is an absolute pleasure to be able to be part of this journey and the version 2.0 together with the Sloan Foundation. And I'm very much looking forward to listen to all the presentations and learn as much as possible. This is, I think, this is really not only the beginning, but already there is something great emerging out of these collaborative research networks.
That's wonderful. And I do see Adam Falk from the Sloan Foundation. I know that this is a way of saying hello to you, and I'm not sure if this was a good time to speak, but
yeah, so I'll just say that I'm probably the one person on this call who's not an economist. So I'm the president of the Sloan Foundation. I happen to be a theoretical physicist. So I will be a fly on the wall. I'm really interested in this work. I'm thrilled that the Sloan Foundation supports it. And I'm really interested to hear how all of you talk about your science and where the state of the field is. So we're very happy to be supporting this work.
That's wonderful, Adam. Marcus, I see you. Would you just one word, and then we can move on to the. Oh,
you're muted,
Marcus.
Marcus.
Wait a second.
Do you hear me now?
Now we hear you.
Yeah. Hello, everybody in the new normalcy. Well, I think a lot of good things have already been said, and the only thing I would want to say is get started.
All right, we're now going to get started. Thank you so much. And actually, the train is running on time. I'm a little shocked. It's New York. It normally doesn't work that way. So, Kory, you are going to open the session on public economics, and you have the right to open, and everybody should know this, open your presentations and share your slides. And that's the way to share your screen. And please begin.
Okay, can everyone see my slides here?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation to the organizers and also to Dimitry for discussing the paper. The work is joined with Jean-William Laliberté, René Leo-Viscano, and Matt Notowadigdo. So the motivation for the paper is that standard tax incidence and efficiency analysis typically makes two assumptions. First, it assumes perfect competition, and the second assumption is that taxes are fully salient. And there's been several approaches in public econ that have relaxed the first assumption. And more recently, there's been a behavioral public finance literature that has relaxed the second assumption, including important work by Dimitry. And where we come at it in this paper is to study these two phenomena in combination. So we provide a new theoretical analysis and empirical analysis of sales taxes, allowing for both imperfect competition as well as tax salience. And just quickly on the theory side, what we're going to do in the paper is derive new formulas for both incidence and excess burden in a model featuring both imperfect competition and tax salience, allowing us to study whether there's an interaction between these two things. The key insight of the paper on the theory side is that tax salience and market structure do interact when considering tax incidence. But on the other hand, when considering the excess burden of taxes, there's no direct interaction. Okay, so what we do then is we take our tax formulas and we estimate the inputs or what we call now sufficient statistics in the tax formulas. We do that by combining Nielsen retail scanner data with sales tax data that vary both at the state and county level. And we estimate the impact of taxes on consumer prices and output using a diff and diff design along with a border pair design. And we estimate the price elasticity of demand, exploiting uniform pricing across stores within chains, which is based on some recent work by Delavina and Genskow. And our tax salience estimates reveal magnitude of around 0.54 to 0.59, which is in the ballpark of some of the other estimates in the literature. And finally, once we have our empirical estimates, we can then calibrate our tax formulas, both incidence and efficiency. To preview our results, we find a lower incidence of taxes on consumers compared to the standard case, whereas if thinking about excess burden, we find a larger excess burden compared to the standard Harberger case with or without salience. So we see our paper is really building on two literatures. The first literature is taxation and imperfect competition. We see ourselves as heavily building on the JPE paper by Whale and Fabinger. And in the behavioral literature, we're building on some earlier work, a paper of mine with Raj and Adam Looney, and then some follow-up work by Dimitry and Rhys Jones, and then work by Farhi and Gabe and others as well. So just to give you an outline of the talk, I'm going to walk through our theoretical expressions for incidence and excess burden under perfect competition, monopoly, and imperfect competition.
Kory, are you intending to advance the slides? Because they're not advancing. Just a heads off.
They're not advancing, really?
No.
You're seeing the first slide still?
Yes, title slide.
Oh, wow. Okay, I have been going through. Do you see them now?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so let me just do that then.
And
okay.
Perhaps you can also try to switch to full screen mode. That sometimes helps as well.
Yeah, that's what I did, but then for whatever reason you weren't able to see it. So I'll just stick with this for now. Okay, sorry about that. We're going to begin with a benchmark model of perfect competition. This largely follows Chetty Looney Koft. I'm going to call that CLK. So we have homogeneous products with perfect competition. We're going to define incidence following Whale and Fabinger as the change in consumer surplus with respect to the tax over the change in producer surplus with respect to the tax. And the marginal excess burden is going to be defined as the change in welfare with respect to the change in the tax. The pre-tax price is going to be given by P. The consumer price or post-tax price is P plus T. And we're going to call the pass-through rate here rho. Okay, so in terms of preferences, we're going to simplify a little bit by assuming quasi-linear utility. And the key here is that we're going to allow prices and taxes to have different effects on demand because taxes may not be visible to consumers. And so we're going to relax kind of the standard assumption that prices and taxes have the same effects on demand. We're going to adopt the same two assumptions in CLK. The first is that taxes affect utility only through their effects on the consumption bundle. And the second is that agents perfectly optimize with respect to tax inclusive prices. Okay, just some more definitions. Willingness to pay here is just marginal utility, and marginal willingness to pay is the change in marginal utility. And we're going to define, importantly here, the salience parameter theta as the change in demand with respect to taxes relative to the change in demand with respect to prices or tax-inclusive prices. This follows CLK. Okay, so we have some key inputs to the formulas. We have the price elasticity of demand, epsilon D, the tax elasticity of demand, epsilon dt, and then the price elasticity of supply. And lemma 1 gives the relationship between these objects here, which we're going to exploit in deriving some of our key propositions. Okay, so just pushing along, sorry for going quickly here, trying to cover both theory and empirics. Proposition 1 gives us the change in consumer surplus with respect to the tax, the change in producer surplus with respect to the tax, and then the fiscal effect, the change in government revenue with respect to the tax. Consumer surplus, there's two terms. The first term is kind of the standard price effect term. So ignoring the case where there's taxes in the baseline equilibrium, take T, which is the tax rate, to be 0, then the change in consumer surplus is just the pass-through rate times Q, because behavioral responses have no first-order effect on consumer utility. So there's an envelope theorem lurking in the background here. However, when taxes in the initial equilibrium are non-zero, then we have a second term, which is a misoptimization term. Okay, so when consumers are misoptimizing, behavioral responses do have a first-order effect on utility, and so our expression here shows how to account for that. Note that in CLK, this expression is not there because we start from a case where taxes are 0 in the baseline equilibrium, so that simplifies things on the consumer side. But here we can see that if there's pre-existing taxes, then there is this additional distortion that one needs to account for. In terms of producers, we assume that producers are fully optimizing, and so the change in consumer surplus with respect to the tax is just the price effect times the change in output, and the change in government revenue depends on the behavioral response to the tax. Okay, so rho here again, just to remind you, is the pass-through rate, and we show here that it's equal to 1 minus theta plus omega times theta, where omega here is simply the pass-through rate in the standard model with fully optimizing consumers. Okay, so importantly here with perfect competition, omega is less than 1, which means that as consumers become more attentive to the tax, as theta goes up, the incidence on consumers is going to go down relative to firms. Okay, that's kind of intuitive. That's a result in CLK. If we look at the expression I here, this is the relative incidence of consumers and producers. The first term is exactly the same as Weyl and Fabinger, rho over 1 minus rho. And then, of course, when taxes are not 0 in the baseline equilibrium, we have this behavioral adjustment we need to account for. And the last term here, dW dt, is the marginal excess burden, which gives us the familiar result that when consumers fully ignore the tax, when theta is equal to 0, that there's no distortionary effect of the tax. Okay, so I'm now going to go through the case of monopoly to illustrate, okay, well, what's different about, or does the effects of salience depend on market structure, which is really the question we're interested in this paper. So just to introduce some more notation, we're going to denote the monopolist's cost of production by C of Q and the marginal cost by MC. The inverse demand curve facing the monopolist is going to be given by willingness to pay minus theta times T. This is very important. Normally, when a tax goes up by $1, willingness to pay and demand goes down by $1, right? But here, because consumers are inattentive, demand is only going to fall by theta for a $1 increase in the tax. And so that's going to affect the monopolist, as we're going to see. So monopolists are going to maximize profits, and we're going to get kind of a standard first order condition. And we have a couple of new objects we need to introduce with monopoly. In particular, we're going to define the marginal surplus, which is the marginal willingness to pay times output, and the elasticity of marginal surplus, which comes about because, of course, the monopolist sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And so when we're thinking about pass-through, we need to know how marginal revenue changes with the tax, not just price. And so that's going to introduce a new term that we're going to see momentarily. And finally, there's the price elasticity of supply, which depends on the change in marginal cost with respect to the tax. Okay, so what's new with monopoly? If you focus on the first line there, really the only new term there is the producer surplus term. here with monopolists choose the price. So there's no price effect for the monopolists because they fully set prices. And so the only effect is the mechanical effect of the tax. And here, normally that's in the standard model, that's just equal to minus Q, where Q is the level of output. And now with Salience, it's going to be equal to minus theta times Q. So there's a theta adjustment. And the smaller is theta, the better that is for producers, right? If consumers are ignoring the tax, then firms like that because that's not affecting their demand all that much. Looking at the next line, the expression for rho, we see it has the same structure, but omega now is going to be different with monopoly. There's going to be this new term, which is going to depend on the elasticity of marginal surplus. And what's neat here is that omega can be greater than 1. So it's well known that with imperfect competition, you might have overshifting of taxes. And that occurs when the elasticity of marginal surplus is negative, which is when the demand curve is log convex. And so under that scenario, if omega is greater than 1, if pass-through is greater than 1, if there's overshifting, then in that scenario, a higher theta, even though consumers are becoming more attentive to the tax, it's actually worse off for them relative to firms, which contrasts with the logic from perfect competition.
Kory, I'm going to slightly break my rules and let you know that you have about 8 minutes.
Okay, all right, I will talk faster. So the last line there is marginal excess burden. We see here it depends on markup and salience. The interesting thing here is that there's no direct interaction. They're additively separable in the formula. And so you just add up these two pieces. There's not much new with monopoly there, at least for excess burden. Let me forge ahead. I'm just going to go and present, just in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk much about utility or demand because we just kind of follow perfect competition. But we have a differentiated products model. What's new here is how we model firms. And we're going to assume that firms have a conjectural belief about what other firms do when they change their price. And I'm going to jump just to the first order condition, which I can walk through and explain intuitively. It gives us a condition for the markup. So at the optimum, the markup is equal to the conduct parameter here, which is nu over J, and the price elasticity of demand. Okay, so the nice thing about this model is that it spans a wide range of market conduct. Perfect competition, we know that nu is equal to 0 and price is equal to marginal cost. Monopoly, nu is equal to J, and there's a whole bunch of intermediate cases in between, like Cournot, for example. Okay, so what we do is we derive new formulas here for the same objects. The new thing here is the effect of taxes on producer surplus. Here we see it's a weighted average between the monopoly and perfectly competitive cases, right? And so you can see that it's a hybrid of the two. And that's going to show up in the formula for pass-through and the formula for incidence as well. Somewhat surprisingly to us, ex ante, is that the formula for excess burden doesn't depend on market conduct. So if you go ahead and estimate markups and salience, you can implement the formula for excess burden that's valid under a very wide range of market conduct parameters, and you don't need to estimate that parameter. However, if you want to know incidence, you do need to estimate conduct. So what we're going to do, what we do in the paper is we really rely on the fact that we have both excess burden and incidence. You really need both of these to pin down empirically either one. So for example, if you want to estimate excess burden, you need to estimate the markup. And of course, marginal costs are not observed. So the way we do it is we estimate the pass-through effect, and we use our incidence formulas to back out the conduct parameter. Sorry, I know I'm going fast here. But once we have the conduct parameter, then we can use the first order condition for the firm to recover the markup and implement our excess burden expression. Once we have that, we can also implement our incidence expression. So really, a lot of papers just consider efficiency or incidence on their own, but really a key part of our paper is considering them jointly, because that's going to help us empirically implement both of them. Okay, so in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to go through the empirical exercise and our calibrations. On the data side, we rely on Nielsen retail scanner data. This is a very nice data set for studying the effects of taxes. We get weekly price and revenue for over 2 million UPCs that are grouped into modules. We link that data to very nice sales tax data that varies both at the state and county level. We also have sales tax exemptions that vary at the state level, matched to Nielsen modules. Our basic research design is a fixed effect design. So essentially what we're going to be doing here, without getting into all the notation, is relying on county level variation in taxes over time, controlling for a rich set of fixed effects. So that's how we're going to estimate taxes, is we're going to basically use a diff and diff kind of research design where we're going to look at the effects of taxes on consumer prices and output. We also complement that with a border pair design, because we have situations where consumers are on opposite side of a border, face very different taxes. And so we could exploit that variation as well. To estimate the price elasticity demand, which of course we need to back out theta, we use, as I mentioned at the beginning, the uniform pricing instrument based on Delavigne-Genskow, and that's how we're going to get the price elasticity of demand. Okay, so here's our empirical results. We find slightly less than full pass-through here of taxes onto consumer prices. Our estimates indicate a tax elasticity of demand of about 0.67 and a price elasticity of demand of 1.2, which imply a theta parameter of about 0.58. Okay, if we go to the border design, which is in the second column, we see our estimates are very similar. Our estimates of theta are slightly smaller in that situation, but not wildly out of line with some of the estimates that exist in the literature. Okay, the last part of the paper is to leverage our empirical estimates and our tax formulas to actually empirically implement the tax formulas. Briefly, the way we're going to do this is we're going to use the estimates for pass-through and tax salience to recover the conduct parameter along with the elasticity of marginal surplus under the assumption that demand is constant elasticity. That allows us to recover the elasticity of marginal surplus. Once we have that, we can estimate the markup given the conduct parameter and the elasticity of marginal surplus. And then finally, we're going to recover the conduct parameter from the markup along with the price elasticity of demand. So here's our calibration results. These are kind of what we call the intermediate estimates. We estimate a markup of around 3%. It's not on its own, it's not huge, but the key thing here is that the markup scales 1-for-1 in the excess burden tax formula, right? And so even small changes in the markup can have decent size effects on excess burden, as we're going to see in a minute. The other thing we find is the estimate for the conduct parameter. We estimate a conduct parameter between 3 and 4%, where, just to remind you, 0 is perfect competition and 1 is perfect collusion or monopoly. So we're closer to perfect competition. That's true, but it's it is different from 0, which is going to have implications both for incidence and excess burden as well. So here are the calibration results for our excess burden formula and our incidence formula. We, just for the sake of illustration, we assume that the elasticity of supply is infinite constant marginal costs. And so under that scenario, if we think of kind of CLK, we get that our I term is equal to infinity, whereas under our model, we get a relative incidence of 17. And as we increase theta in our model, that's the incidence on consumers falls. Next, excess burden, we estimate a larger excess burden effect in our model coming from the markup. So our marginal excess burden is about 2.5 times the size of excess burden when we use the formulas from CLK. Okay, so the markup does have a quantitatively important effect on the excess burden. Just to wrap up, what we do in the paper is we provide a new theoretical and empirical analysis of both incidence and excess burden, combining imperfect competition and salience. We have new estimates of theta, and our results reveal a lower incidence on consumers compared to perfect competition, whereas we find a higher incidence, a higher excess burden on compared to perfect competition, and our results indicate a quantitatively meaningful departure from the perfect competition benchmark, at least in terms of the efficiency cost of taxation, even though the estimated markups themselves are relatively small. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, and you made it on time. Especially if Johannes can now quickly get himself ready and take over and open slides and share screen, and that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers for putting this program together and having me be part of this otherwise fantastic lineup. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk about my work here, which is joined with Andy Muller and Giorgio Toppa. So I'm going to try to use full screen, but Dimitry, please warn me if my slides are not following as I proceed. Okay, so what we're trying to do in this paper is to use the beliefs of unemployed workers to learn about the drivers of long-term unemployment. Okay, so long-term unemployment is a key concern that has a long history, especially in Europe, where the share of long-term unemployed, the share of people who are unemployed for more than 6 months is typically above 50%, but it also has received quite so much attention, especially in the aftermath of the Great Recession, where this share of long-term unemployed increased massively again. And unfortunately, it's a very timely topic again, with the predictions of this share of long-term unemployed going to increase again massively in the months to come. So one of the reasons that we're so concerned about the long-term unemployment is, of course, the obvious cost it has to workers to be without employment for such a long time, but also the inefficiencies that this signals about the labor market more broadly. So this is a big topic, and there is, of course, a long literature trying to think about the sources of the long-term unemployment. But I think the major agreement here is on some of the empirics, and then there is much less consensus about what is driving the empirical finding. So what is the major empirical finding here? The major empirical finding is that the rate at which people find a job is much lower for the long-term unemployed than for the short-term unemployed. Okay, so this is called negative duration dependence, or observed negative duration dependence in job finding. But the big question is whether a given individual will face lower job finding probabilities the longer he's unemployed because of being unemployed, or is it that people who have low job finding probabilities to start with select into longer unemployment spans? So disentangling these two different sources, whether it's true duration dependence versus heterogeneity in job finding driving dynamic selection, is really essential for thinking about the design of an employment policy. Okay, so that's the motivation of what we're trying to get at in this paper. And so what we're offering is first a conceptual framework in which we show how to use job seekers' perceptions to separate these two forces. Then in trying to implement this framework, we're going to document some novel facts and biases in job seekers' perceptions. And then finally, from a behavioral perspective, we're going to study how biased beliefs contribute to the incidence of long-term unemployment itself. So let me dig a little bit deeper on the conceptual idea of the paper. So the main challenge here is, if we observe that 50% of job seekers find a job after a month, the challenge is to know to what extent all of these individuals faced a 50% probability of finding a job, or some face the higher probability ex ante and some face the lower probability, with the opposite extreme having 50% of the job seekers being certain to find a job and 50% of the job seekers to be certain not to find a job. What we're going to do is try to infer the heterogeneity in job finding from the relationship between the ex ante elicited beliefs and the ex post job finding outcomes. So this is building very much on Nathan Hendricks' work, and in particular his job market paper, and we're adapting that to this particular application where we have a dynamic context and where we also know from prior evidence that there tend to be biases in people's beliefs. So from an empirical perspective, the main findings that we will have is that people's perceptions have extremely strong predictive power. So we're going to ask job seekers how long they think it will take to find a job, or what the probability is that they will find a job over the next 3 months. And that's very predictive of whether they will actually find a job or not. Then despite the predictive power, we find that there is an overall bias. Job seekers are too optimistic about their employment prospects, and this is especially driven by the long-term unemployed. And then we'll also see that job seekers do not revise their beliefs downward as they remain unemployed. Okay, so we're going to put these empirical moments together in our conceptual framework to estimate what's going on here, and what the main takeaways of our paper will be. Or main takeaways are, is that heterogeneity explains almost all of the decline in job finding. So in the literature, there is a strong belief that true duration dependence, so for a given individual, job finding prospects going down is an important driver. We find that it's basically explaining only a very small part of the observed decline in job finding. So heterogeneity and dynamic selection is what is the crucial force of the observed decline in job finding. But then on top of that, only half of this heterogeneity is in perceived meaning. Job seekers' beliefs are underreacting to their underlying differences. And because they won't adjust their behavior optimally in response, this will contribute to the large share of long-term unemployment that we see. And we're doing calibration exercise that suggests that the share of long-term unemployed would be 10% lower if we eliminated these biases in beliefs. Okay, so that's the preview. So let me spend 3 slides on the conceptual framework, and I need a little bit of attention to the notation TID, which is the job finding probability for a given individual I who has been unemployed for D periods. So what we observe is the average job finding rate. So the average job finding rate for all unemployed job seekers who have been unemployed for D periods. So that's this expectation here. And the empirical fact that I described earlier is that this is going down as we go into longer unemployment spells. So the average observed job finding rate is going down for the longer people who are longer unemployed. So what the challenge is to decompose the difference, the gap between these two, into a true duration dependence component and a dynamic selection component, where the true duration dependent component will be the average within individual difference in job finding, while the dynamic selection component will be driven by how much my job finding probability today is correlated with my job finding probability tomorrow if I were to be still unemployed. So that covariance that drives the dynamic selection will crucially depend on how much heterogeneity in job finding there is, but it will only depend on the persistent heterogeneity. So from the overall variance in job finding, we subtract the transitory part of it. Okay. So what is the challenge? We don't observe these TIDs. We don't observe what an individual job finding type is at a given duration D. But for those who are still unemployed at duration D, we do observe whether they found a job or not in period D, and we can also elicit their beliefs. And putting these two together allows us to put lower bounds on how much heterogeneity there should be in these T's. Okay, so we're building not just on work that Nathan has been doing, but also work that Morris and Taubinsky have been doing. And I'm still grateful for Dimitry to point me to these as well when I was visiting Berkeley last year. But just using the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, we can put a very simple lower bound on how much variance there in job finding there should be. And it's driven by the square of the covariance between the beliefs and the realizations divided by the variance in the beliefs. So for a given dispersion in beliefs, if beliefs correlate more with job finding outcomes, that must imply that there is more heterogeneity in ex ante job finding types as well. Okay. So more generally, the intuition is that the more predictable workers' ex-post job finding realizations are, the more heterogeneous their ex ante job finding types must be as well. And this simply comes from the variance decomposition, that the variance in job finding is always bounded from below by the variance in conditional means of these job finding. And there is nothing special about beliefs to do this exercise. We can use any observables, whether people, what education that they have, or the gender, and so on. But what we'll see empirically is that beliefs have particular predictive power, or are very predictive, above and beyond what standard controls give us. Okay? So the nice thing of this is that all of this is non-parametrically. So we're just using the predictive power of beliefs. We're not required to make any assumptions on whether beliefs are accurate or how biased they can be, and so on. But if we're willing to impose a model of beliefs, we can go beyond these bounds, and we can go and achieve exact identification. Okay, so that's what we do as well. Last conceptual slide. What we're going to do is assume a linear model of beliefs, where an individual's belief here, what is your expected probability of finding a job in the next 3 months, is a linear function of your true job finding probability, the true probability of finding a job in the next 3 months, plus some noise term, where this noise term could capture noise in people's perceptions, but also noise in the elicitation process through the survey. Okay. Once we're accepting this structural model of beliefs, then we can exactly identify the heterogeneity in job finding, because the higher the variance in job finding there will be, the higher the covariance between the beliefs and the outcomes should be, but then muted by the slope parameter, which captures how much people's beliefs are responding to differences in job finding. Okay, so this slope parameter we can identify as well. All we need is some variation in job finding and see how much this variation is reflected in people's beliefs. So we know that people's job finding probability changes over the unemployment spell. That's this difference that I showed you before. So what we want to know is how much the beliefs are responding to these differences in job finding as well. And so this simple ratio is just giving us an estimate of the slope parameter B1. Okay, so that's all fine. But at this point, we're only learning about the variation in job finding rates at a given point. But we are interested in the variation, or we are interested in the persistent heterogeneity. And to get at the persistent heterogeneity, what we're doing is to use lagged beliefs. And so for people who are unemployed at a given point in time, we're going to see to what extent their earlier illicit beliefs are predictive of their job finding in that period of the unemployment spell. Okay, and so that's this covariance between beliefs or lagged beliefs and job finding that is going to depend again on this slope parameter, and then the covariance of people's job finding type today and their job finding tomorrow, which is driving the dynamic selection. Okay, so that's the conceptual framework. So let's go to the data. I see I have 7 minutes left, so let me not say too much about the data itself. So we're using 2 surveys. One is the survey of consumer expectations. The other is the survey put together by Kruger and Muller in New Jersey. What both surveys have is that they have a question about people's job finding expectations. For instance, in the survey of consumer expectations, the question is here, what do you think is the % chance that within the coming 3 months, you will find a job that you will accept considering the pay and type of work? So that's the first thing, they have a question like this. The second thing is that this is panel data. So not only do we have multiple elicitations of people as they remain unemployed, but we also know when they found a job. So for each individual, we can link their belief with the actual outcome of their job search. Okay. So then using these two data sets, let me briefly summarize or show you these empirical findings that I mentioned before. So the first finding is that beliefs are predictive. So the way I decided to show this here is by showing how the average job finding relates to the perceived job finding, which you see on the horizontal axis. For instance, here we've been all people who perceive the probability of to find a job to be somewhere between 0 and 10%. And we see that on average, their job finding is just above 10%. While everyone who perceives their job finding probability to be somewhere between 90 and 100%, on average, they find a job with 80% probability. Okay, so we see a very nice monotone relationship between the beliefs and actual outcomes. Okay, So we can also do this in a regression framework. And the one thing I would like to draw your attention to here is just comparing the R-squared of a regression when we only use people's beliefs versus the R-squared of a regression where we use a rich set of controls.
Johannes, 5 minutes, as you know.
Very good, thank you very much. Or the R-squared of a regression where we use both beliefs and a rich set of controls. So these suggest that beliefs have a lot of explanatory power. They have a lot of explanatory power above and beyond what these controls give us. Beliefs remain predictive of people's job finding once we control for time spent unemployed, but we see that the coefficient here goes down the longer people are unemployed as well. Okay, so not only are beliefs predictive, lagged beliefs are predictive too. So this we do on a selected sample of people who are unemployed for longer so that we have more than one elicitation. And what we see is that their contemporaneous elicitation is as predictive of their job finding as their lagged elicitations are. So what we learn from this is that there's some persistence in their job finding time, because what they predicted 3 months ago is still relevant for what's happening 6 months after. Okay, good. The second finding is that there is an optimistic bias, but it's very much driven by the long-term unemployed. So what I'm doing here is I'm showing you the average true job finding in gray and the average perceived job finding in black by time spent unemployed. So the gray curve shows the negative duration dependence at work. It shows that the long-term employed have a much harder time to find a job than the short-term unemployed. The black line shows that this negative or this decline is reflected in the perceptions, but the perceptions decrease at a slower rate than the actual job finding does. Okay, so that drives a wedge between perceptions and actual job finding, especially for the long-term unemployed. Going back to my conceptual framework, that tells me that people are underreacting to differences in job finding, and that is what we're going to use to identify this slow parameter that I mentioned before. Then the third thing, and this is a little bit of a detail that we elaborate on in the paper, we allow for people's beliefs to respond differently to cross-sectional variation or to longitudinal variation, okay? And this figure speaks to that. This figure is just focusing on people's beliefs, and the black series, sorry, are repeating the series that I've shown you here on this particular graph. So this shows that the perceived probability of finding a job goes down as people remain unemployed for longer. But if we only look at the within individual variation in beliefs, which is represented by the gray circles, we see that this is basically flat. So a given individual is not updating on average their beliefs either downward or upward, but their beliefs remain the same. Okay, so these are the findings. Then what we do in the paper is we build first a statistical model where we specify the dynamics and the heterogeneity in job finding. We impose structural or functional forms and some distributional assumptions. And then we target these data moments that I've just tried to illustrate on Z and F. And then we estimate this model. And what we find is that heterogeneity explains almost all of the observed decline in job finding. So let me illustrate that here. So on the left panel, what we see is the heterogeneity in true job finding at the start of the unemployment spell. That's the black line here. So quite a few people have less than 20% probability of finding a job in the next 3 months. Quite a few people have higher than 80% probability of finding a job. But as the unemployment spell goes on, the people with high employability leave unemployment, and what remains is a selection of people that are less employable. And it's this dynamic selection that is driving most of the observed decline in job finding that we have here in black. In fact, if we take out all the heterogeneity, if we take out this dynamic selection effect, then the true duration dependence that would remain is illustrated by this dashed line here. So most of it is driven by worse or people who have a harder time finding a job selecting into long-term unemployment. Okay, so we did it structurally, and let me wrap up here. One thing that is nice is that we have these non-parametric lower bounds as well. And we found that our non-parametric lower bound corresponds to 53% of our estimated estimated heterogeneity in the structural model. Moreover, then we find that beliefs underreact to the heterogeneity, something that I mentioned before. And then the last thought that I want to close with is that in the end, we develop a structural model. All of what I've told you so far is mostly a statistical decomposition exercise. But here we're going to make assumptions on how people's behavior responds to biases in beliefs, okay? And the main mechanism at work is the following. If people face poor employment prospects, then they should adjust their behavior to improve their employment prospects. But for that mechanism to happen, they need to perceive that their employment prospects are poor. So to the extent that there is underappreciation of the differences that are there between people, they will magnify how big the differences are in people's job finding rates. Okay, and so we can.
Johannes, it's zero.
It's zero. So we can.
Last word, but it's kind of that.
We can reduce the differences, and by reducing these differences, by eliminating biases in beliefs, we would decrease the share of long-term unemployed people as well. So I have concluding remarks that I think relate to the theme of the conference, but I stop here.
Thank you so much. Dimitry.
I'll stop sharing.
Okay, Dimitry, you ready? Dimitry, you're nearly ready.
Can you see my?
Yes, I'm very jealous. I hope you're not there.
Is my screen sharing successful?
Yes, but most of what we're seeing is somewhere we'd all rather be than where we are.
Okay. I think I need to make this full screen. How about now?
That's good. Thanks.
Good. Okay. Okay. Well, this was these are just fantastic papers. Really fun to read and think about. Both Kory and Johannes have made very important, terrific contributions to behavioral public economics, and these papers are no exception. I think they're a great model of how to combine sensible applied theory with creative empirical measurement to produce some rigorous implications. Just a brief recap. In the paper that Kory presented, the empirical component consisted of new quasi-experimental analysis that estimated the salience of sales taxes. And the finding is roughly that people behave as if sales taxes are only about half as large as they actually are. That's kind of the theta range between 0.5 and 0.6 that Kory presented. And on the theory side, Kory showed us some sufficient statistics formulas that allow us to analyze how the inattention to sales taxes interacts with market structure, and particularly imperfect competition, in determining the excess burden of taxation and the incidence on consumers versus producers. In the last part of the paper, combined the measurement with the formulas to produce these welfare estimates. Johannes presented a paper that analyzed job seekers' beliefs about the job finding rate. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the data, both in terms of the job finding rates and in terms of job seekers' beliefs. So in particular, it's the job seekers who have the lowest job finding rate that seem to be the most over-optimistic, and using both econometric and structural models, what Johannes showed is that this over-optimism contributes to long-term unemployment. Okay. So my comments today are not going to be anywhere near as rigorous as the presentations that you saw. You're probably all tired out from those presentations anyway, so this might be a good thing. Rather, I just kind of want to hand wave my way to some potentially big picture type points. What I want to do is discuss some potential extensions and next steps for the kinds of agendas that are set out in these papers, and particularly in relation to behavioral welfare analysis. And of course, it goes without saying that everything I say really is about kind of, let's think about next steps and research directions. None of this is in any way intended to be a criticism. Okay, so let's just recap a little bit of how we might think about welfare analysis. So when Doug and I wrote our handbook chapter, we kind of divided the inputs into welfare analysis into 3 categories. So one is the question of what is the scope of consumers' concerns? In other words, what do people care about? 2 is which choices are welfare relevant? In other words, what are some criteria for classifying what choices are mistakes and what choices are not mistakes? And 3, what is the choice mapping? Meaning for a given choice set frame, what do people end up choosing? A lot of work typically revolves around question 3, what do people choose? And somewhat around question 2. And typically there's the least discussion around question 1. And, you know, I think both of the papers we saw today kind of fall into this categorization as well. So basically what I want to talk about today is actually just getting us to think a little bit more about question 1. What is the scope of consumers' concerns? And in particular, I want to suggest that it's really important to recognize that people have preferences over information structures due to either attention costs or kind of hedonic things such as anticipatory utility, anxiety about beliefs about future outcomes, and so forth. So in the discussion, I want to elaborate on this possibility in the context of both papers, and then talk about some other kinds of things we might consider doing in the future. Okay, so let's start with the tax salience paper. So Kory had this assumption explicitly on the slide, which is taxes affect utility only through their effects on the chosen consumption bundle. Fair enough, it sounds very reasonable. This assumption was also made in the Chetty, Looney, and Croft paper. And even though I'm going to kind of push back a little bit about this assumption, I've made this assumption before as well. So perfectly fine starting point, but here's kind of a potential first order violation of this assumption, which is that shrouded taxes take some mental effort to integrate into the final price. So what that means is that in the absence of a tax, a person doesn't have to expend that additional mental effort. Whereas in the presence of one of these shrouded sales taxes, the product is going to be both more expensive and the person has to then expend additional mental effort to integrate the sales tax into the price. And since mental effort costs are a plausible consumer concern, there's no reason why we should leave them out of our calculations from consumer surplus. The presence of additional mental effort with shrouded sales taxes would then be a direct violation of the assumption that taxes affect utility only through their effects on the chosen consumption bundle. Now, there's some reason to believe, although we need to explore this a lot more, but I think there is some reason to believe that there are mental effort costs involved in computing sales taxes. So this is a figure from recent work that I have with an excellent UC Berkeley graduate student, William Morrison, where what I'm plotting here is the theta on the y-axis. This is the theta from Kory's work. And on the x-axis is the size of the sales tax in absolute terms. And there's variation in the size of the sales tax, both because of variation in the price of the product. So 7% tax on a $15 item is going to be much larger in absolute terms than a 7% tax on a $3 product. And there's also variation in sales tax rates. That's the difference between the red and the blue. And I think what this figure very clearly illustrates is that the theta changes quite dramatically with the size of the tax. So this might suggest that an attention to the sales taxes is at least in part deliberate, because people are less inattentive when prices are higher or tax rates are higher. And why would an attention be deliberate? Well, probably because attention is costly. So now when we're kind of in this world of costs and limited resources, we are kind of in a world where the presence of these sales taxes does in fact affect consumer surplus through channels other than the final consumption bundle that they choose. Okay, so let me make a couple of analogous remarks in the context of the job search paper. So there's, you know, kind of one reasonable, you know, very, oh, whoops, sorry. Very reasonable sounding statement that says, you know, the biases and beliefs indicate the potential for information policies that aim at correcting these biases. Sounds very reasonable, but there might also be some important nuance involved in information policy design. You know, just as an example, recall the anxiety that I think probably most of us experience when we see a submission decision email arrive in our inbox. Sometimes we might even consider delaying this because we have preferences over the timing of information revelation. But recognize also that this is relatively inconsequential compared to the kinds of things that the job seekers in Johannes's data set are thinking about. You know, imagine that the submission decision would determine if you can pay your bills or not this month. You know, that's a lot of information that has some direct hedonic consequences. And so in general, there's been a lot of work in economics, both empirical and theoretical, suggesting that people do very much have preferences over beliefs, and anticipation or beliefs about themselves can really have important implications for people's sense of well-being. And so, you know, beyond information design, this also, these kinds of microfounded models of utility from beliefs will have implication for some standard public economics questions like optimal unemployment insurance benefit design. So some questions, suggestions for tax salience. You know, theory-wise, it would be interesting to work through the implications using theoretical microfoundations for kind of deliberate, costly inattention to taxes. And then going back to empirics and sufficient statistics, it'd be interesting to think about what are the estimable consequences for welfare and the new sufficient statistics that we should be using once we recognize that there might be some mental effort costs involved. You know, it seems like a lot of these questions about costly or deliberate attention could be explored in Nielsen data. You know, I showed you a figure where there was data for high versus low price products. I think you could do something very similar like that in the Nielsen data set. You know, there are expensive products there and there are cheap ones. Related to this, there are questions about whether the size of the sales tax change matters. You know, certain models of inattention might suggest that people might react less to smaller changes than larger changes. There are questions about learning that could be in principle analyzed. Because, you know, the price instrument, for example, can have many lags. So you can estimate kind of medium run, short run, and sort of trending toward long run consequences of sales taxes versus prices. You know, there are questions about choice complexity, which certainly relate to the market structure, kind of in spirit relate to the market structure questions asked in this paper. So things like the size of the product line or the number of competitors probably add to choice complexity. And if we think of attention as being kind of limited, we might think that things like that might detract attention from sales taxes. This is just kind of an example of a variety of questions we might think about through the lens of a costly attention model. Job search, you know, here I think there is kind of maybe a natural starting point is just this question of, do job seekers have interesting preferences over
Dimitry, I
information?
know I have limited authority to do this, but you're very close to the end.
Yeah, and that is true for the slide, as for
Okay.
where my slides are. This is my last one. You know, there have been experiments on providing information to job seekers. And it's also possible to just analyze to what extent do job seekers value this information, for example, as in the willingness to pay for social information design from Alcott and Kessler, combined with the kinds of structural techniques that Johannes has already developed, these kinds of information RCTs with a willingness to pay design could allow us to better understand direct preferences over information structures. And then that would kind of lead to some interesting theory questions. If we take one of these theoretical models of utility from beliefs, you know, perhaps quantified with the kind of empirical exercise I'm sketching out here, what would be the implications for formulas of optimal unemployment insurance design, and what kind of information policies would be well for improving. To conclude, these are some fantastic papers showing an attention and perfect perception can play a big role in economic settings. The measurements, of course, have first order implications for welfare. And the main thing I just kind of wanted to suggest in this discussion is that it might be interesting to think more about the scope of consumers' concerns, and in particular, that consumers' concerns involve utility from beliefs. I think this might be an interesting next step for work in behavioral public economics. So I'll finish here, and now we can have some Q&A.
So thank you so much, Dimitry. Let me give Kory and Johannes very quick right of first comment before Stefan will take the questions. And we've noted that please type in questions if you're in the attendees. And for panelists, the Q&A may not be working perfectly. So use the chat potentially to communicate with Stefan while we get these first answers. Thanks.
I'll just respond briefly. So thanks very much, Dimitry. Those are all excellent questions, and definitely things worth thinking about, both for our paper and then for the literature, as you suggest as well. In some ways, it comes full circle, your comment on thinking about the welfare effects of deliberate inattention. When we first started the project with Raj and Adam, the way we were thinking about it was more in the spirit of a model of bounded rationality, where consumers had to spend a cost to kind of learn the tax. And we derive formulas for excess burden, and you know, as you're kind of suggesting, it depended on things like the distribution of costs in the population. So I think, you know, your intuition and some of your other work is exactly right, that these things aren't going to matter, and it's worth pushing the literature in that direction to try to come up with more a micro foundation, I guess, for you know, what we call theta in the literature and inattention more generally. But thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Johannes?
Yes, thanks a lot, Dimitry. Those were excellent comments. So let me be brief on, like, yes, I fully appreciate that there is a trade-off when we try to inform people that we're constantly deceiving ourselves to be happy, but as a consequence, we're making bad choices as well often. And I think there is this trade-off, and we should take that seriously. More if the incidence of these biases falls on particular people, and this is something, sorry for advertising this for tomorrow, but that Ben will be talking about. Like, we see that it's often a certain type of people that are making those mistakes. So I don't think we can just rationalize the biases away as people are doing this to feel happier. Then I like the suggestion on how much would they gain from better information. So this is something indeed we can calculate and then compare that to their revealed willingness to pay for better information. That's something we can think about. And for the theory, sorry for doing this, but how would the Bailey-Chetty formula look like if we only cared about their perceived expected utility? That's something that I did in my job market paper, and then you would simply keep the original Bailey-Chetty formula. There is no correction to the Bailey-Chetty formula if you just care about people's perceived well-being, but it's only when you care about their true expected utility that envelope conditions don't work anymore, and that you have to make corrections there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Johannes. And now, Stefan, it's for the, especially for those who have had to attending and have interest. You must always, get your questions in. And Stefan.
Right. Okay. So I will take over to moderate the Q&A session. And as some of you have noticed, panelists do not actually seem to be able to ask any questions using the Q&A feature. They can only answer them. But you'll be able to ask these in person. And for the attendees, they can just go ahead and ask the question in the Q&A feature. So we've had two questions by Xavier Gabex. Would you like to just post them in person briefly? You may have to unmute yourself still.
Great, thank you. So those are two really super interesting papers. Congratulations. So questions first to Kory. It's so very, very important issue in welfare and macro and growth is what's the welfare gain from new goods. And so the traditional formula for that, if you have a new good that sells $1 billion, is the total welfare gains. It's $1 billion divided by the elasticity of demand. But so if people are inattentive to the full price, not just the tax, but let's say to the full price in some sense, then you're going to underestimate the elasticity of demand by a factor of 2, like the theta you find in yours. And as a result, you're going to overestimate the welfare gain from this new good by a factor of 2, okay? And so it would be nice if you're to know if you're misperception, underestimation of elasticity by a factor of 2. Is it just for the tax, or does it carry for the full price? And that's a very, very big deal, because for when people look at the CPI and all that, those are very big effects that they can account for, like 1 percentage point in CPI or that things. Okay, so that's one question for Kory. And for Johannes, so a very natural interpretation, perhaps, channel is, I was highly paid for some reason at my firm, maybe because my union was favoring me or something like that. I lose my job. I still think that, I used to be paid $25, but my market wage is more $12. But I want a job at $25. And as a result, I'm over optimistic. And so a prediction of over optimism would be a difference between the market, the wage they had before and the market wage that that would be fair given their skills. And so is there a way to measure that? And then does it have a predictive power for the bias? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Javier. Those are all great questions. I definitely agree with you that, ideally we want kind of like the steady state or the long run elasticity. We don't engage with that as much in the current paper, although in my paper with Raj and Adam, we did spend a little bit of time, at least for the alcohol analysis, looking at kind of longer windows and kind of testing whether the short run and longer effects were the same. Partly it was to get at exactly that question of whether consumers are learning over time about taxes, because the alcohol, or sorry, the experiment we did at the grocery store was very much kind of just a short run effect. And so the obvious question is whether there's persistence in these kind of salience effects. And at least in that context, we did find that the effects tended to persist in the long run. But again, that's a very specific application. I think more work needs to be done to kind of think about other settings. In terms of the gains from trade, this is actually a good time to plug my other work, where in some other work with Matt as well, that formula for the gains from trade is to a large extent driven by preferences. It's in some respects. So, like assumptions like CES imply that the gains from trade are pinned down by the price elasticity demand. So we have some other work showing that if you consider kind of a broader class of preferences, you can show that the gains from trade or the gains from new goods rather are not identified by the price elasticity demand, and you need an independent source of variation. We use variation in variety itself. You know, we have an instrumental variable strategy, and so we can look at you know, a different measure of the gains from trade. But I agree, that's the traditional approach, and I think I definitely agree with the spirit of the question. I think more work needs to be done on the empirical side for sure.
If I can make a comment, that we're going to have to go quickly through question answer. So maybe just a very brief answer, Johannes, then we'll get the other questions. And it may be that we need to continue this slightly into the break for those who want to stay on.
Okay, so thanks for that excellent suggestion. So we haven't looked into this, and I think we could look into this with a survey of consumer expectations, because there we have data on wages before people become unemployed. Maybe let me advertise work by Conlon, Philosoph, Wiswall, and Savard, I think, where they elicit people's expectations about the wage offers that they will get, and then they see how people's expectations adjust depending on the offers that they get in. But so yeah, I think it's a good suggestion. We can think about it, and I think it's something. Well, let me keep it at that, given the instruction to be short and brief.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Then Surpreet Kaur had a question next.
Hi, Johannes. I really enjoyed your talk. I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about what you think might be a micro foundation or a reason for why people cling to these persistently optimistic beliefs. So Javier had one potential reason, but you could imagine that naive beta delta could mean you think you're going to search really hard, and that's why you have these optimistic beliefs. It could just be belief-based utility. So I was just wondering if you had a view on what could be happening.
Yeah, so I realized that there is a result that was on one of my slides, but I didn't advertise. But in the Kruger and Muller survey, we in fact see the beliefs go up. So if anything, people are becoming more and more positive the longer they're unemployed. And so we have tried very hard to see what this trend like, or what this correlates with, and we haven't found anything in the data itself. And to us, one very appealing residual explanation is the gambler's fallacy, that the longer you're facing bad draws, that at some point you think this good draw will come, and you are like some kind of entitlement effect, that you feel that you've had enough negative draws and that the positive draws should be coming. But another explanation is the optimistic expectations that that Dimitry was talking about, that you want to like have a rosy view of how the world looks like, and you don't want to accept that like your unemployability is potentially poor, and adjust your behavior for that. So yeah.
Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Then we had a question by Justin in the chat, which has been answered already. But if you'd like to ask it again in person so that we could discuss it publicly, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So I think the spirit of the question was about whether the budget constraint matters, and I could be misinterpreting Justin's question here, but my answer was that at least with quasi-linear utility, if you think about excess burden, it's how much the allocation that the agent chooses is different from the allocation they would choose under a lump sum tax. And if the agent completely ignores the tax with quasi-linear utility, that's the same allocation that they would choose with a lump sum tax. And so it doesn't really matter in a model with quasi-linear utility, but once you have income effects, then it does matter how the agent meets the budget constraint. And so I think it definitely does come into play once you have income effects. And I think that's not so much in our current paper, but it is very much in the paper with Raj and Adam.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Then we had a question by Isabel. I'm not sure if she's here. How about John Leahy?
John, are you there?
Brian, coming. So I was wondering if there's any probability structure under which optimism would kind of be a form of selection. I mean, in the Johannes's paper, so that, you know, these are people who've gotten persistently bad draws in some way, and that somehow you select, you know, these are just unlucky people. Is there any probability structure in that works?
So I saw that question, and I did prior work on this, and then you're frustrated that you're not able to link it to this particular application. No, but so I have to think about that. But one thing that we propose in the paper is a behavioral explanation, which is that optimistic people would set reservation wages too high, okay? And as a consequence, they remain unemployed for longer. So it's the optimistic people who select into longer unemployment. So yeah, that's a behavioral thing. But I wonder whether there is something more mechanical going on as well, and that I don't immediately see. The mechanical effect would be like, if we look at the people who state the most positive beliefs, think that the probability is very high to find a job, on average, we would expect more optimistic people to be represented in that group. But like, yeah, then you have to think about how just positive beliefs by itself would affect job search behavior as well. But it's something to think more about. Thanks.
All right, thank you all very much. We have reached the end of the official session. Stefan, if anybody has their hand up, and if Johannes and Kory want to stick around, you can stick around for the few minutes, but we should all go. Otherwise, get ourselves a coffee, refresh, or whatever we need to do. See you again in just over 10 minutes.
I think, do we have to confirm? No. So that's an excellent question, and something that we've tried to think about quite a bit. And I don't think it matters for the positive part, for the first part of the paper. So whatever the relation is and in whatever direction the causation goes, we're trying to do a decomposition analysis where we're just using the predictive nature of beliefs. But then going to more of the normative prescriptions, or just also the behavioral model. Like in the behavioral model, we try to be very consistent. So we impose a model structure. So we do a McCall search model where people set their reservation wage and they have beliefs about arrival rates. And then if you think that the arrival rate is very high, you will set a very high reservation wage and so on. And then we target, like we don't have direct information about arrival rates, but we target job finding rates and perceived job finding rates as we see them in the data. So there we're internally consistent as well, which is that if people are optimistic, they will adjust their reservation wages, and that may affect their job finding outcomes, but also the biases and so on. And so there we're consistent as well, but we read all of this through the lens of one particular model that we impose on the data. And so ideally we would have like more direct information on this to test whether the model is meaningful there.
I guess one way I thought this might be important is that if you're finding people becoming more optimistic as they go along, then one reason for that could be that they're running out of money, so they're adjusting the type of jobs that they accept. And so it's like, yeah, now I'm sure I'm going to get a job in the next month because I'm going to accept anything. Now I guess you're saying they're still optimistic, so they are inaccurate in their beliefs, but I could at least explain why people felt that their jobs finding probability might go up the longer they're waiting.
So I agree. So know that some of these things we looked into. So we have survey information, of course, but about their liquidity. And we've tested this, whether like people become more liquidity constrained and whether this is driving like the need of finding a job becomes higher, or maybe the need to have optimistic beliefs becomes more pronounced as well as a consequence. And we don't find anything there. So yeah.
Johannes, would you know how these beliefs correlate with mental health measures over the course of the unemployment spell? you know, so one big concern would be, you know, people become depressed or more depressed as they're unemployed, or as they get, you know, as Dimitry was saying, that like disappointed over and over again. And do we know how any mental health measures correlate with these belief measures in your data or other data?
So we don't, but let me say two things. So the first data set that I worked with in the context of beliefs, like, and that I used in my job market paper, was collected by psychologists who wanted to find out how couples deal with depression during unemployment, and they asked them about how long they would find it, how long it would take them to find a job. And they wanted to do an experiment where they did some video treatments, and nothing came out of that. So, but like psychologists have been interested in this and related it to expectations, but I haven't seen any evidence on this. But then, like we started this survey, we added these beliefs questions to the Kruger-Miller survey 10 years ago. And then we were anticipating to see a lot of discouragements. So we thought that like people would stay positive, and then suddenly get discouraged. And we very much tried to find patterns like this in the data, but we didn't find any of this. But then linking it to mental well-being, yeah, we don't have that in the data, but that would be super interesting to learn more about.
Thank you. I'd love to see the earlier psychology paper.
Yes, I'm happy to share. I'll try to find it. I'll send it to you.
Thanks so much.